it's definitely much easier to ship weirdo stuff and try things out. And further, like I know that at least in some cases, background talk, people not putting their names on the record, that people look at Brave as like kind of the point of the spear as doing like the strangest stuff but trying stuff out that they would be nervous and curious to see what will happen. So on that end, it's way easier to try weird stuff in Brave.
Welcome to the Technical Marketing Handbook, a podcast sponsored by Simmer, where we talk about the technologies, concepts, and phenomena relevant to those working in digital marketing. Today, our topic is ad blockers, and we are joined by a true authority on the subject. Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Technical Marketing Handbook. My name is Simo Ahava. I am your host, and I'm also the co-founder of Simmer. For those working in analytics and in digital marketing in general, ad blockers seem to be a point of contention. On the one hand, we celebrate the privacy advances that blocking potentially harmful third-party scripts entail, but on the other, we curse at the loss of data that follows. Ad blockers, content blockers, and privacy blockers all seek to take control on behalf of the user. Essentially, they block harmful scripts from being downloaded, and they also block network requests from being sent by the browser. There's always some type of a prescriptive list that determines which request should be blocked and which script should be blocked, based on matching the domain name or other parts of the URL of the script or the request. Browsers such as Firefox, Brave, and Edge incorporate blocking mechanisms directly, so it's not just a browser extension as ad blockers have traditionally been. Blocking potentially harmful resources seems to have very little downside at first glance, because no one really wants crypto miners or fingerprinters to run their scams in the user's browser. And there's also an increasingly large population of people who simply don't want to see any ads. And this population is particularly interesting as it's really impossible to say what the intent of their use of an ad blocker is. Some might want to block ads to make pages load faster, as these pages no longer need to expend resources to load scripts and images. Some might want to block ads to preserve privacy, as they're worried about what data advertisers will be able to siphon off the user. And some might want to block ads because they simply don't care. The point is, we don't know why any given user uses an ad blocker, and we don't know why any given ad gets blocked. Now, one of the problems that follows is that there are certain scripts and utilities that look like ads but really aren't. Or maybe they are ad scripts, but they are used for something completely unrelated. An example close to my heart that comes to mind is Google Tag Manager, which is often blocked by browsers and ad blockers. Now, GTM itself isn't an advertising or data collection machine, but the majority of GTM users certainly use it for this. However, it's possible to run Google Tag Manager without doing any data collection whatsoever. And some people do use it for enhancing the site experience, running A/B tests and stuff like that. If GTM is blocked, then a potentially significant part of the user experience on any given website can be lost. In these cases, the question arises, is it okay to circumvent ad blockers if we're not actually doing any advertising or other privacy infringing tasks? So speaking on behalf of the site owner. Well, that might be okay if you want to err on the side of the user choosing to use the blocker because of ads specifically. But what if they use a blocker to improve performance? I'm personally against wasting resources to try to circumvent ad blockers just to get more data. I think this approach has the potential of disrespecting the user if our guess for why they use the blocker is actually wrong. However, there are gray areas all over the place when it comes to ad blockers. Who gets to decide what gets blocked? Who takes responsibility for critical site functionality breaking down? Is there any innovation in the space, or is it just prescriptive lists of domain patterns and paths that need to be blocked? Well, I'm so excited to introduce my guest, who's the perfect person to answer my questions. Pete Snyder is the Senior Privacy Researcher and Director of Privacy at Brave Software, the company that's created the Brave browser, and quite recently, actually, Brave Search. He's got a long list of research publications to his name, mostly around privacy engineering, data security, and new standards and practices for developing browser privacy controls. He's an active member of the W3C, where he pursues topics relevant to privacy aspects of new web standards. The list of resources and research material he's contributed to is impressive, so I urge you to take a look at his website linked to in the show notes. Pete was kind enough to take the time out of his busy schedule, and we had a great chat about ad blockers, browser standards, and more. We'll jump to the interview right after these words from our lovely sponsor.
Are you a marketing or a data professional looking to skill up? Take a look at the online courses Simmer has to offer at teamsimmer.com. The courses are completely self-paced, and your enrollment will grant you lifetime access to the material, including any updates. Go to teamsimmer.com and use the coupon code HANDBOOK to get 10% off your course purchase. That's teamsimmer.com.
Pete Snyder from Brave, could you please explain how ad blockers prevent the loading and showing of ads in a web browser?
Sure. Just to distinguish, so people use the term ad blockers kind of for two different purposes. It's a kind of overloaded term. One is a piece of software that prevents advertisements from appearing on a browser, and there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. And second is kind of like the broader category of what are really kind of like content blockers, or just like browser intervention tools that aim to apply a bunch of different policies to change a site from what the developer intended to what this user desires. And ad blocking is one application of that technique, but those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And so I can answer either of those questions, or I could try to answer both.
Well, I think content blocking is kind of the more generic term, or covers more bases, so we'll go with that this time.
Sure. So content blocking then is usually what people mean is ways of making decisions over network requests before they happen. It's not all it is, but that's kind of the common case. And the most common case for that is usually the tools that consume filterless rules, usually in the AdBlock Plus format, which are things that look kind of sort of like regular expressions that are basically just rules, like trust statements over URLs. So URLs that look like this and have these kinds of properties should be blocked, and URLs that look like this shouldn't, or things along those lines. And there's a bunch of kind of crazy ways those rules can get complicated, and I could talk more about that. But broadly, that's what generally people mean is blocking, not making network requests that aren't desired, and then potentially additional kind of interventions that can be done in the browser to remove the side effects or cosmetics or whatever of things that weren't able to be blocked in the network.
Why are they used? I mean, what do you think the main motivations people have? Is it always about privacy? Is it about speed or performance? Is it for the most knowledgeable people, I guess it's also about avoiding those tricky attack vectors that nobody else really knows about. What do you think the main motivations are? Yeah,
so this has really been surprising to me. So I came to Brave thinking people care about Brave for privacy, and everything else is just kind of like stuff you put on the sticker. And that's really been a surprise to me. I mean, I think probably the majority of people who use Brave care about it for privacy reasons. But something that's been that's hit me over the head a whole bunch of times since working here is that people want to block stuff for a variety of reasons, and privacy isn't the main one. So I've been totally just like sobered out by how many people just want to like save battery life. And that really just means like find the minimal subset of resources that I make those and make nothing else. I don't care what the intention is behind those requests. I just want the bare minimum number of things to get the pixels on a page to let me do what I want to do. So that's maybe one extreme. The other extreme is I don't care what happens on the page. I just want my privacy protected. And then there's a bunch of kind of spots in the middle, which are, I want to kind of have some kind of split the difference thing with the site, where I'll allow certain kinds of things I might not want, but I'm willing to tolerate. But I just kind of want to swing the decision back in my favor or trade it off.
So when Brave implemented ad blocking, was it there from day one? Was it already blocking certain ads when the first version came out?
I believe so. I wasn't there from day one, so I can't say 100% for sure. And Brave has its roots in some really kind of like things that are really just kind of prototypes that were don't really have much deep connection to Brave as it is today. But as far back as I know, there's always been some form of content blocking engine built into Brave. Sometimes there's been multiple, which has caused bugs and some surprising things. But there's always been something to do stuff that looks AdBlock Plus, uBlock Origin like in the browser, and now there's that and then a dramatically more powerful set of tools on top of it.
And Brave still uses kind of a block list approach. So there's a prescriptive list of host names and pattern matches that are looked for in those network requests, or is there some algorithmic decision making going on as well?
So Brave does a bunch of things now. So we ship a whole bunch of filter lists. So that's Easy List, Easy Privacy, Black Origins lists, some compatibility lists, some other things. Those are all open source and set explicitly. And there's also additional lists that people can toggle on if they want to get wild with it. And then there's a bunch of kind of like quasi clever stuff that Brave does. But mostly we try to do it server side and use that to populate lists, not to do it at runtime on the client. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is that maintaining extremely like systems that need to be very aware of different parts of the browser engine in Chromium is extremely difficult, given how fast upstream moves and how not malicious but indifferent Chromium is to kind of those goals of Brave. And so that really pushes us to try to push complexity to places that aren't the browser and to make the browser side of it as not simple by any means, but to limit the cost there.
Right.
And then there's other things that we do that are kind of like content blocking that are algorithmic, that are happening in the client, but they are not decisions over network rules.
Right. So they're not too intrusive on page performance or device performance.
Yeah, and those are things like storage, like kind of a novel approach to managing browser storage, a pretty novel or unique way of defining its browser fingerprinting. Some kind of like try to trade off between we're going to try to block cosmetically things that we think look like third-party ads and not first-party ads. That's a unique thing that Brave does. It's algorithmic and some other things like that. But the guts of it is filter lists and maintaining filter lists.
One of the things I've been curious about for a long time is you have these filter lists, and they're mostly available for anyone to look through. I mean, they're open source, many of them, and they take suggestions from the community. But who owns the lists? Who governs them? Who makes the decision on whether a host name should be added to those lists? What's the process there?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be like infuriating to anybody who's been unhappy with the filter list at one point. But the point is that shockingly little, like it's like basically 4 people who do this, like, you know, on their coffee break during it's extremely casual. We wrote there's a couple papers we had that all kind of touch on this. One is just kind of like, I think we called it Who Filters the Filters or whatever. But the point being that EasyList largely has 4 maintainers. One is now employed by Brave. One is employed by IO, the people who make AdBlock Plus. I don't remember who their other 2 maintainers are, but they contribute at a lower level. But I believe the main EasyList maintainer is now a Brave contractor. That's a can of worms to say, and so I want to just clear the air or clear my throat a little bit and just say, like, we are extremely, extremely cautious about pushing Brave needs into EasyList. And I can point to a whole bunch of places where we've made our life much more difficult by pushing things downstream into a Brave maintained set of patches against upstream. That's a serious like thing that I take important to. Like, EasyList is not a Brave project. Right. It is a tool that Brave pulls in and makes changes to do Brave goals. Anyway, sorry. So the point is that there's a huge tail of people who contribute to these things. There's an extremely small number of people who make the final decision about like what gets merged. And in some cases, there's some lists that are even less maintained. Like EasyList and Easy Privacy is, well, one, like those. If you're a person who finds those tools useful, like those people just do like God's work or whatever. That's a silly way of putting it, but I just mean like totally thankless work. They don't get paid for it until extremely recently, and even then, most people contributing those projects don't get paid for it. They get shouted at constantly. They have constantly a 5-alarm fire about some rule broke something that they've never seen. But despite all that, like there's actually a surprisingly large amount of like at least documentation that goes into this, and so I don't want to sound like I'm bagging on them. Like they do extremely good work, and triple so under like the pretty difficult constraints that they work under, the limitations they have.
Do you know if there's ever been efforts to turn it into some kind of a standards project, or to have a larger governing body that would be, more populated, first of all, but also maybe devoid of too many biases, or have enough biases so they even themselves out?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything that's standards in like W3C standards body kind of standards, and I'd be amazed if anything ever came out of that. That was the kind of long list of arbitrary decisions that are called a standard. I don't think that's likely to ever have much appetite there. But Easy list is kind of in the middle of a spectrum. Like on one extreme, our list, like Peter Lowe's list, which is just a set of basically what used to just be like a host file that you wget around the web or whatever, and that's consumed by a lot of filter list tools too. And that's really just like, did Pete get enough coffee when he woke up in the morning and made his choices? I mean, it's true. I don't mean to suggest that he's trivial, but just that he is the sole arbiter of what goes in that list, and there is no governance process other than what does Pete think.
Wow.
And on the other extreme are things like Disconnect, which don't produce filter lists rules that are in the AdBlock Plus format, but they do exactly the same kind of thing, and there's a one-to-one translation between them. And they have a very kind of smoky room or very secretive, not public decision process, but they have a long set of documentation about the rules that they use. Sorry, I think I said that poorly. Who makes those choices is not clear, and it is not a public process at all. But they advertise a methodology that they follow. But that's one extreme, and Pete Lowe is on the.
So when we have a situation where a host name or a pattern is added to the list and it starts looking through those network requests and seeing what should be blocked or prevented from loading in the browser, what do you do about breakage? So there are scripts that have multiple purposes that are not only for tracking or not only for injecting content, but they can have some actual functionality on the site. So what are the options here? How does a browser that actually does have a very impressive monthly active user base like Brave now, how do you prevent Brave users from being disadvantaged when using the web?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's $1 million question that nobody has an easy answer to. And I can say, I think this is no secret to say, or this isn't a company secret or whatever. But like, the claim I make to Brave C-suite folks or whatever is that I am sure that web compatibility issues from filter lists are the biggest crisis that Brave has, or the biggest problem that Brave has, at least in terms of not figuring out how to pay the bills or whatever. Not that there's a worry about Brave paying the bills, but whatever. Biggest technological problem that Brave has for retention or whatever. And it's extremely difficult. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of options. Largely what people do is do nothing and wait for... the most common thing is do nothing and wait for people to report problems and then make exceptions to the rules. So don't try to fix what the filter list does, but wait till somebody complains about it and then at least just stop blocking stuff on that page. That is extremely unsatisfactory, but it is not technically difficult to do. So it's something that non-technical crowdsourced contributors can do, and it's effective. People can at least make some kind of balance between functionality and privacy that way. It's not great, but it works.
So you have a block list, and then you have a list of sites where the block list shouldn't be active, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit circular because those rules are also in the same filter list, in the same lists. But yeah, that's exactly. You have a large list of rules, and then a surprisingly large list of exceptions. Yeah, so that's the common case thing. The next thing that some sites do, or some projects do, is what's called resource replacements. And so this is uBlock Origin has done this for a long time. Brave has done it for a slightly less long amount of time. Firefox recently announced that they're doing something like this. And this is basically saying instead of blocking a thing or allowing it, let's have some third option, which is to replace it with a stubbed out alternative implementation. And so this would be something like, I want to load Google Analytics or a page needs to load Google Analytics, but if you block that, bad things happen on the page. So let's instead use some hollowed out thing that has the shape of Google Analytics, but it doesn't actually do anything that has kind of privacy implications. And that's a very extremely successful strategy, but it's also extremely difficult to do because you have people who have to tear into extremely large chunks of code to reverse engineer how these heavily minified or whatever libraries work. It's awful. And so as a result, it's just not commonly done. It's done, but it's done for only the most popular scripts on the most popular pages and whatever. Good approach, but it doesn't scale. Another approach is, stop me if I go on too long, because this is a topic I could talk about for a long time, but I got at least two more, then we can go into the weirdo stuff too, if you like. Another option is to do kind of runtime enforcement. And so this is something that a whole bunch of different browser vendors have tried at different times. But basically to say something like, I'm not going to block a script, but I just want to control what the script does on the page. So maybe I'm going to load, not to keep picking on Google Analytics, but maybe I'm going to load Google Analytics, but I'm just going to stop it from accessing storage or something like this. And so that's when you can imagine how that would be a useful of blocking privacy stuff, privacy harm, but allowing functionality. Conceptually, this is a very appealing idea, but in practice, it's extremely difficult for a whole bunch of reasons. The main one being, some of them are just difficult but well understood. So you don't actually have to just check the top script. You also have to check the call stack and the scope stack and stuff like that. That's difficult but not impossible by any means. Some of them are just fundamentally difficult because of trade-offs made elsewhere in the browser. What I'm thinking about mostly here is there's a whole bunch of tricks that V8 does. The system I'm most familiar with, but I'm sure SpiderMonkey and JavaScript Core do similar things that optimize certain behaviors that make understanding where code came from extremely difficult after it's been compiled. So these are things like deferred compilation. There's a whole bunch of different queuing systems and code that gets put in there. It's very difficult to figure out where it came from in a form way, blah, 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 blah. The point being that there's a whole bunch of choices in JavaScript engines, mostly so that they can go fast, that make it extremely difficult to relabel this script came from that script, or this code unit came from that file. So it's conceptually simple, but in practice, extremely difficult to roll out. And then the last one is something that's kind of much more on the frontier, or not frontier is just a silly way of putting it, but just something that's kind of been on my mind, and I've talked to some people who've been kind of interested in it. So right now, modern like JavaScript applications, including websites, usually have node-like build systems where you import a bunch of modules using things like npm and require and whatever. And those are largely replacements because the ES6 module system didn't really exist or in its current form when those choices were being made in Node. But now that it does exist, a lot of people have said, boy, it would really be nice to not have to have this kind of like compiler-driven build step for your applications. Why don't we ship the module graph as it is to clients? Because that's like the most pristine way of doing it. And maybe you could like compile a whole bunch of modules at the same time and it would go faster, blah, 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 blah. Nobody is doing that right now for a bunch of reasons that I could go into. But if you did that, and if we get to a world where people were shipping the module graph instead of the minified JS file or whatever, that would be a really neat thing. It'd be useful for application builders because there would be less build steps. It would be useful for the browser because it could optimize different behaviors, and particularly be useful for people like me or blocking people, because if you had like the information-rich graph to make decisions on instead of the flat JavaScript file, you could be much more clever about the kinds of interventions you make, and you can make smaller interventions, which means breaking less sites. That was a long-winded way of saying it is difficult.
I could have guessed that the answer is that it is difficult, but what about other? So we're still talking about blocking things, and then we're talking about shimming things and stubbing things. What about? Is there a possibility of just allowing these scripts and pixels to do what they are doing, but prevent them from actually sending any useful information forward? And what I'm actually going after here is that there's a wonderful browser, Clicks, the browser project, which unfortunately went down during the COVID last year, and maybe related, maybe unrelated, just had to add some context here. But they had something that I was curious about, which is they try to algorithmically identify which parts of the request could potentially be a persistent identifier, for example. And so they started stripping those out if they noticed that the same type of ID was present in multiple requests on different pages, even on different sites. Do you think it's possible that these heuristics themselves will change to a more kind of intelligent approach rather than being just pattern matching and based on prescriptive rules? And this kind of ties, maybe not directly, but maybe it's if you can kind of outline what your research with this so-called sugarcoat project is, because that seemed not exactly the same thing, but also seemed to be having some kind of a more intelligent approach to these heuristics themselves.
Sure. A whole bunch of topics. So if I go down the wrong road, pull me back out. But about the Clicks project. I mean, so you may have heard that Brave is releasing a search engine. A lot of that is the exact same people who come from Clicks, and so I'm very familiar with that system. The algorithm, or the kind of like algorithmic heuristic approach that you're describing, that comes out of their human web work, was a paper. Boy, I wish I could remember where it was published, but there's a paper describing exactly that system, and it's very similar also to the system that they use to build and now Brave used to build our search indexes, which is exactly as you say. You only want to visit pages, or you only want to include pages that look like other people have already visited them. So you're kind of like imposing some kind of like canonity-ish kind of protections on top of stuff. I can go into like why that's a great defense if you don't think the site is trying to circumvent you or try to work around you. But any kind of system like that. It'll be easy to circumvent at the margins. Anyway, that's one idea, and I could talk more about how that works in the Click system, or at least as well as I remember it, and the kind of considerations Brave is making there. Second one is not exactly that heuristic, but what you're saying is the approach of let's not try to make choices about what's good and what's bad, but let's limit capabilities in some kind of general way. so that and maybe there's web compat benefits that come out of that, or certainly there's at least less maintenance cost that comes out of that, and more predictability that comes out of that. I think it's a great idea. I think it's a necessary but not sufficient kind of approach. But what you're describing is largely the reason Brave does things like farbling fingerprints and partitioning storage, and why Safari is very cautious about making choices about what gets blocked or doesn't want to block stuff, but does want to partition storage and whatever else. Largely, that's the story that comes out of Google's privacy sandbox thing, although a much more nuanced and one that we could sure talk a lot about. But anyway, basically the idea has been like, let's not be gatekeepers and say what's good and what's bad. Let's instead just like sandbox everything and make it so it's impossible for sites to do bad things. And I don't think these are incompatible approaches. I do think that saying I'm not going to try to block bad things when I know they're bad is in a way like browsers abdicating their responsibility on behalf of users. But absolutely, like people who are building privacy tools should absolutely figure out ways to make it harder for sites to do bad things. I just don't think it's enough in and of itself. It's table stakes at this point.
This actually nicely segues to another discussion on this topic. Is you mentioned Safari, you mentioned the privacy sandbox, and Safari and Chrome are obviously they have a huge market share on desktop and mobile. And it seems to me like obviously they have to be very careful about the decisions they make because they impact immediately such a large part of the browser user base. And in the case of both of these vendors, they also have operating systems that are impacted either directly or indirectly. Is the fact that Brave is still by many magnitudes smaller than these on your user base, does it give you more liberty to try out stuff and pioneer things that could, if Safari or Chrome tried to do them, could be intercepted as an affront on or a direct attack on web compat, for example? Is Brave, and I'm not saying this in any way a belittling way, but is Brave small enough that you can kind of do stuff and willing to do stuff that bigger browsers couldn't do? So kind of not circumvent, but kind of go past the standards discussions and just pioneer and pilot things.
Yeah, a bunch of thoughts there. One is that I would say, and happily point to examples where the large browser vendors you talk to also just basically sidestep the entire standards process too. So setting that aside, yeah, absolutely. Like Brave is obviously in an extremely different situation than Safari and Chrome and Edge and even Firefox are. So that's for sure the case. I'm not sure that all means that Brave can do things more easily than everybody else can. I think it for sure I can think about ways that it cuts both ways. I don't know how that balances out, but like, yeah, on one hand we can be like, I wonder if farbling will be a useful way of replacing our fingerprinting protections, and I have to like basically have a coffee with Brendan and convince him, and then maybe get him to assign 2 people to me to implement it or whatever. Like we can do stuff real fast, or at least conceptually very fast. I basically have to convince 2 people or 3 people, Bondi and Brendan and a couple, my boss, Ben, and whatever. Those names won't mean anything to people listening. I apologize. Anyway, it's definitely much easier to ship weirdo stuff and try things out. And further, like I know that at least in some cases, background talk, people not putting their names on the record, that people look at Brave as like kind of the point of the spear as doing like the strangest stuff but trying stuff out that they would be nervous and curious to see what will happen. So on that end, it's way easier to try weird stuff in Brave. But the opposite is also true. Like when Safari says that they're going to block something, every web developer worth their salt is going to update their website to accommodate that. They may hate it. Maybe they'll even file a lawsuit. I don't know. But like, people will change their sites to work in Safari. People will not change their browsers to work in Brave. And so in that sense, Brave's task is enormously more difficult. I don't know who has it easier, but I know that there are things that cut both ways.
There are a couple of examples of things that Brave has been in the spearhead for. And I think, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you were, out of these browsers that we've been talking about now, you were the first to blanket block third-party cookies. Like Safari has had third-party cookie blocking since their first version, but they've had mitigations for visiting in first-party context first, at which point you kind of allow the site to seed. But Brave has blocked cookies in third-party requests earlier than Safari's complete block, which came only last year or the year before that.
It's more, yeah. I mean, this is like a long story of people trying something and then thinking, oh my God, what have we done, and rolling it back over and over again. And I don't claim to know the history thoroughly, but for sure you're right that Brave had a default policy of never sending blocking all third-party storage, including third-party cookies, from day one. People will also point out fairly that we also shipped exceptions to that policy to unbreak sites. A very small number of exceptions, but exceptions nevertheless, and that's a fair criticism, or at least a fair caveat. But it's true, yeah. I mean, I think it's still fair to say that Brave has by far the most aggressive storage policy, even now that we don't block third-party cookies anymore, or we block them on network requests, but now we partition them and make them storage in frames, which is an approach that we've learned from others. But we're still doing by far the most aggressive kind of storage management.
Maybe we could, for the benefit of listeners, just if you could explain what partition storage means in comparison to just preventing access to storage altogether.
Sure. So this is not a Brave. I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, this is not a thing that Brave. This idea is not something that comes out of Brave, but Brave's run with it in a kind of unique way. But So in general, there's kind of a couple ways that you might, if you see an iframe, for example, that points to, I don't know, thirdparty.com, and you see it over on two different first parties, there's a couple things the browser could do. The browser could say, oh, okay, well, I know what third party is, and so third party gets the third party storage area, and there's just one storage area per domain, and that's cookies and storage or local storage and all that other stuff. Another possibility is to say, I don't. That seems scary to give them that tracking capability. I'm just going to block storage completely, and so that code and network operations happening in that third-party frame would just not see any storage at all. That's basically what Brave did until recently. And then kind of a third category is, instead of to give third party in this case a different storage area for each first party that it appears on. So that means code operating on thirdparty.org, this iframe, would see a different storage area when it appeared under A than under B. That's broadly what partitioning means, but there's a whole bunch of differences about like how long a partition stays around for. Are there ways to punch holes in partitioning for people who want to give a third party back unrestricted unpartitioned storage? Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole bunch of differences, but those are kind of broadly the three approaches people are taking.
You're still allowing access across site boundaries between two domains to access each other's storage, but you're just preventing that storage from leaking out to other first parties. So being able to sniff the shared partition from other first-party contexts.
If third-party appears on A and third-party appears on B, that doesn't mean that A gets to access third-party storage.
Right.
Third-party still, there's no things can't talk across the origin boundary. That's just the same origin policy in effect. It's just that it's all about what cookies does code running in third-party under A, C versus B,
right,
and all the other stuff that lies with cookies.
All right, thanks for the clarification. The other feature I had in mind was, and this is a very interesting thing that Brave does, because I haven't seen any other browser do this before or since, and it seems like a very heavy-handed thing to an otherwise kind of elegant approach to blocking and tracking protections. But the idea of stripping out URL parameters that have been listed, so just a self-managed list of URL parameters that need to be stripped from URLs. Do you know the background of that decision, or how did that come to be? So there's the Facebook Click ID, the Google Click ID, the MailChimp ID, the Microsoft Click ID. So all these different types of advertising parameters that are obviously being used to pass identities around, but to strip them completely out of the URL, that's an interesting approach that I haven't really seen anywhere else.
Yeah. A couple. One is that Brave, I think, alone does that by default, although Firefox does something similar for Facebook redirections in the refer field, I think. But I think I'm confident that Brave is the most aggressive by a country mile in this case. And I know for a fact that we're about to roll out a whole bunch of additions to that and expansions of that capability. UBlock Origin, I think, now has the ability to strip some query parameters too, if you're interested. But the reasoning behind that is that while partitioning storage is an extremely useful kind of broad, clever approach to preventing linking, it is almost too clever by half. I don't know. I'm not sure. Whatever. What I mean is that there are other ways that people link you or link cookies or track you across boundaries that aren't just typical generate, store, transmit, persistent identifiers. That might be fingerprinting. That might be syncing profiles based on your email address or some other identifier you provided the site, or your credit card number, or whatever else. But there's a gazillion other ways that people try to link session behavior or link storage areas. Broadly, this falls into something called bounce tracking, which is not itself a totally well-defined thing, but sits in this kind of pool of tracking technique where you assume that each storage area is completely partitioned and can't see across each other, but people attackers want to be able to link those storage areas and say, these are distinct, but I know that they both belong to the same person, and bounce tracking and things that look bounce tracking are a way of doing that. by pushing identifiers across those first-party boundaries. And so all the kind of query parameters you mentioned are, I don't know if they're bounce tracking or things that are just bounce tracking like, but they're ways of pushing identifiers across first-party boundaries for the most part. And so there's a bunch of things you can do about that, but stripping them out is the easiest one. And so people have criticized it, understandably, as being not like a foundational or like fundamental kind of protection. And I think that's certainly true. Like we see the system that's deployed now and exploit its weaknesses to protect our users or whatever. And so there's a cat and mouse game, but if you're playing a cat and mouse game, it's better to be the cat than the mouse, right? Like and so anyway, point being that like that is a weird, not a weird, but like a unique thing that Brave does among, at least in terms of default policies that browsers have. Brave is going to do a lot more of it very shortly, and other things that are kind of like that. But it's to prevent bounce tracking and things that look bounce tracking like.
Right. Moving towards wrapping this interview up, but I have a couple of questions. And the first one would be like a general bit of advice or peering into the crystal ball. But when you think about the whole field of privacy engineering in browsers and the kind of, which feels something like an uphill battle, but I think all browser engineering really is working against public opinion many of the times and trying to make the web faster and more secure. Where do you think the biggest wins will be in the near future when it comes to protecting the user's right to privacy by the browsers? Do you think the biggest wins are in restricting access to storage, for example, or are there some grander plans in the works? Do you think Privacy Sandbox has the answer, or where do you think we're going on with tracking protections?
I'm not a big fan of the Privacy Sandbox approach. So we could talk more about that if it's of interest, but I don't think that's the answer, or at least I'm sure that's not the end of a discussion. There are good, appealing parts of that proposal. The first thing that comes to mind, maybe not of interest to your users, or at least not the kind of thing they usually consider, but I think legislation is increasingly important. So Brave ships this thing called Global Privacy Control, for example. I played an extremely small role in writing that spec, but have been involved in that discussion or that effort. And we now see like legislation and attorneys generals and people to make these decisions, people in those roles, saying if somebody is sending the Global Privacy Control label or signal in your jurisdiction, that means you have to give them GDPR protections, or you have to assume this under GDPR, or you have to assume this under CCPA, or you have to assume this under whatever the relevant privacy legislation might be. And that solves entire categories of tracking harm that are extremely difficult to think about how to solve through technical intervention alone. So I used to think that stuff was extremely boring. I now think it's like extremely important, even if it's still kind of boring.
The legislation aspect is actually, I want to just quickly dig into that. The speed of technological development, obviously, you have roadmaps to follow, you have features to ship, and then compare that to the speed of how legislation progresses, which is snail-like in comparison, or glacial-like almost. Do you think, how much is legislation behind the decisions you make on a daily basis when shipping privacy-related features? Do you think about the implications of, for example, GDPR? Are you implementing GDPR? Are you doing something orthogonal to GDPR? Do you still leave a backdoor open to circumvent GDPR? How much is it present in your thoughts these days, and has it changed over the years to be more prevalent? I think you mentioned that legislation has become more important, at least to you. But do you think it's and is it a guiding principle in Brave's work, for example, these days?
Yeah, the global privacy control thing is a thing that is in Brave browser right now and is like delivering Brave users tangible privacy improvements. So it's in my mind to that degree. And the GPC group that we have a call once a week or so, and it's in my mind to the point where like, boy, we really ought to figure out ways to get more legislation to hook into this, because this seems like it's solving categories of problems that have been calcitrin or whatever. But in terms of like moving fast and moving slow, I'm not sure I know that start like whatever, move fast and breaks things, that kind of thing. But like, I kind of think that's horseshit. Google says they need 3 years to remove third-party cookies. Like that's not like moving fast, y'all. Like that's like you've been doing a bad thing for 20 years or for 10 years, and now you need 3 more years to stop doing it. Like that's not moving fast. That's procrastinating intentionally to preserve a certain market that places you in a preferable position. So anyway, I'm not here to say that legislation is fast or nothing. I'm just saying things move fast when they need to move fast, right?
Right. To kind of wrap things up, first of all, thank you so much and I know that you've been a bit under the weather, so you've been extremely kind to to accommodate this interview in your schedule. But I want to kind of wrap things up with a little thought experiment, and I'm going to give you temporary godlike powers now. And by the snap of your fingers, you can change any aspect of the internet, anything related to your work as a privacy researcher, as a browser engineer, and you can change the status quo to whatever direction you like. And so I'm interested in knowing, what would you do with that power, and why would you do that?
I'm not sure I'll say the same thing tomorrow, but the thing that comes like that I think off the top, sitting here right now is, I think, not a change I want to see in Brave specifically, but a change I would love to see in terms of the decisions that browser makers make, which is, I want browser makers to be more opinionated and more responsible with their users. And so that is to say, I think browser users should not say, well, we just got to create a set of laws and sites will do what they do. And so let's create a good set of laws and, head out for lunch early or whatever. That's dismissive, and I don't mean to be totally flip about it, but like, I hope browsers will say, like, I see a bad piece of code on the web, and I am going to arbitrarily stop that from happening in the browser for users, because I don't think the people who use my browser want that. I also wish that there would be, if you sit someone down, some browser PM somewhere will say the right thing and knows the text to copy paste, but just manifestly, users are not the number one priority for at least two of the top browsers right now. Unambiguously. They will say otherwise, but just plainly, the choices that are being made in the system are not, users want this. They are, we need certain things to happen, and so what is a way that we can get users to tolerate them? Unambiguously. And that seems like straight up evil and awful, and like, we'll wind up as batteries in the Matrix if we keep doing this for a couple of years.
That was a very eloquent answer. Thank you so much. Would you like to tell our listeners how to follow you, how to find your writings? What's the best way to keep up to date on what you're working on?
Sure. If you're interested in reading, boring 12-point conference publications or whatever, I have a website at Peter E. Snyder that lists them, and most of those or a good chunk of those are at brave.com/research too. I have a Twitter handle, or Twitter at PES10K that I update a little bit. I got a lot of Midwest in me, and I'm pretty conflict averse, so I'm not on Twitter too often, but every once in a while, Brendan will nudge me, or something will really get under my skirt or whatever, and I'll jump on Twitter. But otherwise, yeah, those are the two main places to keep in touch. I'll just say, for folks who might be listening, we're interested in collaboration, or I'm interested personally in research collaborations. If people are have students or are looking for privacy-friendly people to do privacy-friendly research with.
Wow, that's an excellent suggestion. We'll add all these things to the show notes for people to find. Once again, thank you so much for making time for this, and keep doing your great work. I'm sure that you'll get at least a couple of new followers, hopefully, through this podcast, and supporters of what Brave is doing for the web, and what you are doing privately for Brave and for the web as a consequence as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks again, Pete Snyder, for that interview on the Technical Marketing Handbook. If you enjoyed what you heard, don't forget to subscribe using whatever podcast service you enjoy taking your podcast with. And tell your friends and family, maybe give your long-distance relatives a call and tell them all about this podcast so that they can subscribe and hear the next episode as it comes out in a couple of weeks' time. Until then, take care.